Hi, I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. And one of the most popular is our online lunch lecture series. Those of you attending today represent many business sectors such as hospitality, food and beverage, financial services, and CPG, as well as MSI members such as Ford, Colgate, Ipsos, Marriott, and others. So we're delighted to welcome you to learn more about how politics can influence shopping behavior. Before we begin, I'd like to point out the Chat with Presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Nailya Ordabayeva is Assistant Professor of Marketing at the Carroll School of Management of Boston College. She has a PhD in Management from INSEAD and a Bachelor of Science in Management from Bill Kent University. She researches how social and sensory perceptions influence consumers' purchase decisions and how they impact well-being. Her expertise focuses on the effects of social hierarchy, status, and sensory perception on purchase decisions. Her research has appeared in top marketing journals as well as top psychology journals. Her work has been recognized by multiple awards, including the Journal of Consumer Research Best Article Award. Nailya's findings have received coverage in popular media outlets such as New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Forbes magazine, and the BBC. And prior to joining Boston College, she was faculty member at the Rotterdam School of Management of Erasmus University in the Netherlands. So we're very pleased to have Nailya here today. And Nailya, take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you everybody in the office or at home joining the webinar today. Today I'll be delighted to share some observations and insights with you about how politics can influence shopping behavior. The findings that I will cover today are from my joint work with a colleague from the Católica Lisbon School of Business and Economics, Daniel Fernandez. Political polarization is on the rise. The Pew Research Center has been tracking political attitudes in the U.S. for decades, and it finds that the gap in the opinions of conservatives and liberals has been increasing. For example, here's the gap in the opinions of Democrats versus Republicans in 1994. This gap is relatively small at that point in time, but it consistently increased in the decades that followed. It reached new heights during Obama's second presidency and record levels during Trump's first year in office. What is interesting is that this gap in opinions towards various issues across political lines has been growing faster and larger compared to other gaps in opinions along other demographic lines. For example, in a different survey, the Pew Research Center looked at people's opinions towards 10 different basic issues, such as government regulation, immigration, and the environment, and it found that the gap in opinions towards these issues between conservatives and liberals grew larger and faster than the gap in opinions towards the same issues across other demographic lines, such as younger people versus older people, men versus women, and so on and so forth. Political polarization is important perhaps because the predominant majority of adults can confidently self-identify themselves as either liberal or conservative. According to recent surveys, these numbers are upwards of 65% of adults who self-identify themselves as such. And this polarization is impacting people's lives across many domains that have little to do with politics. For example, there have been many reports in the media about how the political divide is splitting up relationships and families, especially around the holidays. And this is based on some hard data. For instance, on the romantic front, a recent survey by a dating website reports that political differences is cited as the #1 reason for breaking up with a romantic partner among women. Coincidentally, a #1 reason for breaking up with a romantic partner for men is weight gain. On the family front, there's been a significant increase in the percentage of people who report having argued with their family because of politics or political differences. 16% of people say that they have stopped talking with a family member or a friend because of political differences, and 13% of people say that they have broken off a relationship with a family member or friend altogether because of politics, especially since the recent election. Beyond romantic relationships, politics and polarization is impacting other domains in life, such as where people prefer to live. For example, it turns out that conservatives and liberals prefer to live in different types of environments. Conservatives like to live in larger homes that are further apart and that are within a few miles distance to schools, restaurants, and shops. In contrast, liberals like to live in smaller homes that are closer together and that are within walking distance towards shops, restaurants, and schools. These different preferences lead people to select themselves to living in neighborhoods and geographies where they're pretty much surrounded by other people who share exact same political views, and they do not get exposed to people who have differing opinions. This particular phenomenon has been described as the geographic sorting phenomenon, and it was described in this book that I show here to you on the slide. And it has been occurring not just in the physical or geographic space, but also in the online and media environment. So there are many reports about people self-selecting to consume different types of media and to navigate different types of online environments where they're pretty much surrounded by other people who have the exact same political views, or they're not surrounded by, not exposed to people who have opposing opinions. Well, the reason why we're all here today is because politics and polarization impacts the marketplace. First of all, an important way in which politics can influence the marketplace is directly by explicitly shaping consumers' expectations of brands and companies in response to various political issues, debates, and controversies. So a recent survey of marketing managers conducted by Duke University and the American Marketing Association found that the predominant majority of managers, 83%, believe that it is inappropriate for their brand to speak up or take a stance on a politically charged issue. This is fascinating because it is in stark contrast with the data that comes from consumers. For example, a different survey conducted by a company called Sprout Social found that the predominant majority of consumers, 66%, believe that brands should be taking a stand on political and social issues. And this is because most consumers believe that brands are credible when they take a stand on political or social issues. And there's even some data to suggest that there might be some benefits to doing so. For example, the percentage of consumers who say that they will praise a company for taking a stance on a political issue with which they agree exceeds the percentage of people who say that they will criticize a company for taking a stance on an issue with which they disagree. All of that said, details are important. More specifically, it matters which issue it is that companies take a stance on or voice their opinions on. And this is because people have different reactions to different types of political issues. For instance, for issues like human rights or labor laws or poverty, the predominant majority of consumers agree that companies should speak up and take action. But on issues like immigration or LGBTQ rights, there's a much more mixed consumer reaction towards the issue of whether or not companies should be speaking up. But whatever issue companies choose to speak up on and to take action on, what is important is that the issue, this stance, this voice will only be viewed as credible if the particular issue is highly relevant to the company's core business. More specifically, company voice or action is only going to be credible if it directly impacts its customers, employees, or business operations. For instance, CVS's decision to take a stand on tobacco, that is, to remove all tobacco products from its stores in 2014, was viewed as highly credible precisely because the specific issue of tobacco was highly relevant to the company's core mission, which is keep consumers healthy. And this particular action was highly effective because it led to a significant decline in the tobacco use among youth, especially in areas where CVS has a high market share. What it seems to boil down to is that a company's action will only be viewed as credible and will be successful if it is viewed as being sincere on the company's front, on the company's part. And there's no better example for that than Pepsi's recent campaign featuring Kendall Jenner, where they tried to associate with the protests and civic unrest that was happening around political issues. And this particular action was seen as completely insincere, pretentious, and irrelevant by consumers, and it led to all sorts of outcry online and offline, forcing the company to withdraw their campaign to mitigate the damage. So far, what we have discussed is this notion that political polarization can impact the marketplace directly by explicitly shaping consumers' expectations of what brands and companies will do in the context of political issues and debates of the day. What I would like to talk about next is this idea that politics and polarization can also impact the marketplace indirectly by implicitly shaping the types of products and brands that consumers choose to buy. And in exploring this possibility in our research, we were inspired by some emerging trends. For example, in the 2012 presidential election, pollsters found that Obama voters like to dine out at Red Lobster, drink latte, and entertain themselves with jazz music, whereas Romney voters like to dine out at Olive Garden, drink black coffee, and entertain themselves with college football. Inspired by these interesting trends, we in this research focus on how consumers use products and brands in order to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. We focus on consumer differentiation because the desire to stand out and to be different is ubiquitous, and it is an important predictor of human behavior. Being different boosts people's self-esteem, it makes people experience positive emotions, and it leads people to choose different products and brands in the marketplace. Companies know this, and they very prevalently appeal to consumers' differentiation needs by adopting different types of positioning and communication strategies. For example, Mercedes' famous slogan, "A class ahead," communicates to consumers that the consumer will be ahead of their peers if they were to use this particular brand. And many other examples exist across other industries, such as technology and apparel, where different brands use different slogans and positioning strategies to communicate to consumers that they will somehow be different from their peers should they use this particular brand. Now, if we look at the different ways in which consumers can use brands and products to differentiate themselves from others, there's really two broad types of differentiation. On the one hand, consumers may try to differentiate themselves from others vertically in the social hierarchy by using products that show that they're better than others. An illustrative example of this would be a consumer showing up to a job interview wearing a luxury watch and an expensive suit to communicate to others that they are more competent, more affluent, and smarter than others. A common way in which consumers differentiate vertically is through the consumption of high-status, high-priced luxury brands, and luxury brands know this, so they very famously and prevalently appeal to consumers' vertical differentiation needs through the various advertising and communication campaigns that they use, as shown in the examples on the slide right here. And the luxury industry does this very effectively, as its sales increased to $1.2 trillion in 2017 alone, and is expected to rise in the years to come. Aside from vertical differentiation, consumers may also want to differentiate themselves from others horizontally by choosing products that will show that they're somehow unique or different from others in a non-hierarchical, lateral way. An illustrative example of this would be a consumer showing up to a job interview wearing red sneakers just to communicate to others that they're unique, that they're cool, that they're unconventional and non-conforming compared to others. A common way in which consumers differentiate themselves horizontally would be through the choice of products that have unique designs, styles, colors compared to other offerings in the marketplace. Now, we propose that political ideology is going to influence people's preference for vertical versus horizontal differentiation in the social hierarchy. We predict that this is going to happen because conservatives and liberals have different beliefs about the legitimacy of the vertical hierarchical structure that exists in society. Specifically, conservatives believe that the hierarchical structure that exists in society is legitimate, as it reflects legitimate differences that exist in how hard individuals work and how motivated they are. So if you work hard and you're super motivated, you end up at the top of the hierarchy and you deserve to be there. But if you don't work hard, then you end up at the bottom of the hierarchy and you don't deserve anything more. Liberals, on the other hand, believe that the social hierarchy that exists in society is illegitimate because everybody works hard, but some people end up in higher hierarchical positions because they have better luck or better social connections. So we propose that These differences in conservatives and liberals' beliefs about the legitimacy of the social hierarchy will translate to people's preferences, conservatives and liberals' diverging preferences for vertical versus horizontal differentiation of the social hierarchy. More specifically, we predict that conservatives will prefer to differentiate themselves vertically by choosing products that show that they're better than others. This is because conservatives believe that the hierarchical structure that exists in society is legitimate, and therefore products that signal one's dominance are legitimate symbols of one's exceptional character, high virtue, and important qualities. In contrast, we propose that liberals will differentiate themselves horizontally in the hierarchy through the choice of products that show that they're unique from others in lateral, non-hierarchical ways. This is because liberals believe that the hierarchy that exists in society is illegitimate, and therefore signals of dominance are illegitimate ways of showing one's unique qualities, exceptional characteristics, or values. And therefore, they will choose lateral, non-hierarchical ways to communicate their unique values and characteristics. So this is the basic idea that we tested in a line of different studies. And what I want to do next is I want to present to you the basic insights from just a few of the studies that we ran, where we tested this basic proposal across different consumer populations, product categories, settings, and contexts. So let me start with the very basic demonstration of the effects in this simple study. So in this study, we had a group of Boston College students who, first of all, indicated their political ideology on a one-item scale, where they were asked to locate themselves on the following scale of political orientation, from 1, extremely liberal, to 9, extremely conservative. This particular scale is actually very well established in the literature. It has been validated as a very well predictive scale that can predict various political outcomes, such as voting behaviors. After indicating their ideology, people were presented with a choice between two products. Specifically, people were told that they could win a coffee mug in a lottery, and they could choose between two designs of the coffee mug. Both designs of the mug had the seal of Boston College on one side of the mug, but the other side of the mug differed between the two options. One of the options had a vertically differentiating message, just better, printed on the other side of the mug, versus the other option had a horizontally differentiating message, just different, printed on the other side of the mug. What people needed to do is indicate which of these two mugs they would like to win in the lottery. To see what could be potentially explaining the link between political ideology and product choice, we measured people's beliefs in the legitimacy of the hierarchy through a scale that was developed in the past, very well established, and it included items such as some groups of people are simply inferior to others. Here is the basic effect. The more conservative people became on the scale of political ideology from 1 liberal to 9 conservative, the more likely they were to choose the vertically differentiating mug, just better, over the horizontally differentiating mug, just different. More specifically, each 1-point increase on the scale of ideology in the conservative direction led to an almost 7% increase in people's choice of the just better mug, vertical differentiation, over the just different mug, horizontal differentiation. This effect was explained by the differences in conservatives and liberals' hierarchy beliefs, and we found very similar patterns of results when we used non-student samples and when we measured ideology and hierarchy beliefs with some delay. What I want to show you next is a variation of this particular study and design where we changed up a few important things just to verify that this basic pattern that we're finding is in fact legitimate and generalizable across different contexts. So the first important difference that we made in the study was we measured ideology using not a single item scale that I showed to you before, but a more comprehensive scale that measured people's attitudes towards different issues that tend to divide people along political lines. So these issues included things like capital punishment, abortion, gun control, and so on and so forth. Afterwards, we presented people with a choice between two existing brands of products rather than custom-made mugs. In this case, people could win gift card from a clothing company, from a clothing brand, and they could choose between two brands for their gift card, the vertically differentiating Ralph Lauren versus the horizontally differentiating Urban Outfitters. And I want to note here that we selected these two particular brands based on a series of different pretests where we included multiple different brands, and these particular options uh, revealed themselves as highly effective in communicating vertical and horizontal differentiation. Finally, to explore what could be explaining the link between ideology and product choice, we looked at hierarchy beliefs as well as some alternative options such as people's desire for high product quality and need for uniqueness. Here's the basic result, and as you can see, the graph is very similar to what we had before. The more conservative people became on the scale of political ideology, the more likely they were to choose the vertically differentiating brand, Ralph Lauren, over the horizontally differentiating brand, Urban Outfitters. Once again, this pattern of results, these differences, were explained by the differences in conservatives and liberals' hierarchy beliefs as opposed to other things such as desire for quality or need for uniqueness. Now, whenever you try to establish whether or not your factor of interest, in this case political ideology, in fact drives the outcome that you're interested in, product choice, it is important to test the basic premise using an external manipulation or prompt that changes people's perceptions of that factor, in addition to just measuring the inherent differences in the factor. So what we try to do here, essentially, is follow that model, and we try to externally change people's perceptions of their political ideology in order to verify this causal relationship. We believe that we could feasibly change people's perceptions of their political ideology with an external prompt because there's some emerging data suggesting that if you take the exact same individuals with the exact same set of beliefs, they can actually perceive themselves as more conservative or liberal depending on the type of a social environment in which they find themselves. So you take a person with the same set of beliefs, and if you place them in a blue state surrounded by very liberal people, this person will perceive themselves as a little bit more conservative in comparison to others. But if you take the same person and you place them in a red state surrounded by very conservative others, this person will perceive themselves to be a little bit more liberal compared to others. So we use this logic as inspiration in order to devise our external manipulation. And this is what we did. We asked half of the people to remember a time when they were talking to or interacting with somebody who was more conservative than them. And the idea here was that when you think about interacting with somebody who's more conservative, you should perceive yourself to be as a little bit more liberal in comparison. The other half of the people was asked to remember a time when they were interacting with somebody who was more liberal than them. And the idea here was to make people feel a little bit more conservative in comparison. After undergoing this task, people were presented with a description of a brand of athletic shoes, and we described to them two lines of this brand of athletic shoes. One line was vertically differentiating. It was described as luxurious and extravagant. The other line was horizontally differentiating. It was described as hip or eccentric. And what we tried to do here, we tried to keep people's perceptions of product quality constant across these two lines of products. And so we informed people that Consumer Reports had rated both of these lines of athletic shoes, and it had Consumer Reports gave a scoring of 92 out of 100 to both lines. So the quality was, in fact, identical. Then we looked at people's preference for vertical versus horizontally differentiating lines. What we find is that people's preference for the vertically differentiating line of shoes, luxurious, extravagant, was higher when people perceived themselves to be more conservative as opposed to when they perceived themselves to be liberal. And once again, this effect was driven by hierarchy beliefs. And what this right here shows is that you can change the positioning of your product line in order to better appeal to either a conservative or liberal consumer base. We tried to build on this idea further in the next study, where we modified the positioning of the product in order to see whether we can appeal to conservative versus liberal consumers the same way. What we also do in this next study that I want to show to you is, in addition to modifying the positioning of the product, we also want to check whether or not the effect of ideology that I've shown to you just now could be explained by something much simpler, some demographic variables such as income. And so in order to tackle this issue, in the study, we recruited people from 4 different brackets of income: low, mid-low, mid-high, and high brackets of income, and we got equal numbers of people from each of these brackets. We had participants tell us their political ideology, liberal versus conservative, and afterwards, people read that they were going to a professional networking event. Typically, people wear black outfits to go to professional networking events, so people read that they would expect most people to wear black to this event, but that they were themselves considering wearing red. And what we did next is we tried to play around with the positioning of this product color to be specific, in order to make it vertically versus horizontally differentiated, and so to make it more appealing to conservatives or liberals. We achieved that by having half of the participants read that they had come across a magazine article which described the color red as the color of success, accomplishment, and prosperity in the 21st century. This was meant to make people perceive the red outfit as vertically differentiating. For the other half of the people, we described the color red as the color of originality, rebelliousness, and edge in the 21st century. And here the idea was to make the product be perceived as horizontally differentiating. And here's the basic result. When the product color was positioned as vertically differentiating, as the color of success, conservatives were more interested in this red outfit. However, when the product color was positioned as horizontally differentiating, as a color of nonconformity and originality, liberals this time were more interested in this red outfit. So once again, you see that you can change the positioning of the product in order to make it more appealing to conservative versus liberal segments. Importantly, all of these patterns were driven by the differences in political ideology and not by the differences in income. What I want to show you next is this idea of how can we further find ways to externally change perceptions in order to change inherently held preferences of conservatives and liberals for different types of products. And we do that in the study by changing people's perceptions of hierarchy's legitimacy. So just to remind you, at the core of our theory is this idea that conservatives and liberals will prefer different types of brands and products to differentiate themselves because they have different beliefs about the legitimacy of the social hierarchy. If that logic is correct, then externally changing people's perceptions as being legitimate versus illegitimate should actually shift conservatives and liberals' inherently held preferences for different types of products. So following this logic, in this study, we first measured people's political ideology, liberal or conservative. Next, we manipulated their hierarchy perceptions. Half of the people were asked to tell us a story of when something good had happened to them, and they were specifically asked to focus on the role that hard work, self-discipline, and wise decisions played in helping them get there. So this here was meant to frame the social hierarchical top positions as being legitimate, as being the result of hard work and self-discipline. The other half of the people were also asked to describe something good that had happened to them, but this time they were asked to focus on the role that chance, opportunity, and help from others played in helping them get there. So this here was meant to frame the hierarchy as illegitimate. In other ways, it framed the top hierarchical positions as being the result of external factors such as chance or opportunity rather than hard work and discipline. Afterwards, people made a choice between the two brands that I showed to you before, the vertically differentiating Ralph Lauren versus the horizontally differentiating Urban Outfitters, for a gift card that they could win in a lottery. What I'm going to show you here is the percentage of people who chose the vertically differentiating brand, Ralph Lauren, over the horizontally differentiating brand, over Urban Outfitters. So the higher the percentage shown here, the higher the choice of Ralph Lauren, and the lower the choice of Urban Outfitters. So when the hierarchy was framed as being legitimate, conservatives preferred Ralph Lauren, the vertically differentiating line, whereas liberals preferred Urban Outfitters, the horizontally differentiating line. In fact, conservatives were 2.5 times more likely to choose the vertically differentiating line brand Ralph Lauren over the horizontally differentiating brand Urban Outfitters. However, when the hierarchy was framed as being illegitimate, Conservatives' preference for Ralph Lauren, the vertically differentiating line, dropped by almost 37%, and this time both conservatives and liberals preferred the horizontally differentiating brand Urban Outfitters. So this here basically shows that you can change perceptions of the social hierarchy, and in effect that will change people's inherently held preferences for different types of products and brands. What we tried to do in this final study, right here, was to check whether or not a basic premise would hold with broader and larger amounts of data. So in order to achieve that, we analyzed Google searches that were conducted in conservative and liberal U.S. states. We analyzed Google searches because Google search data is publicly available, first of all, and second, it is highly predictive of product choices, product purchases, and various outcomes. For example, the more likely you are to search for a specific movie in a specific geographic area, the higher the purchase incidence is going to be of that movie. People are more likely to be watching that movie. The same thing holds for cars, homes, video games, and even the spread of the flu. This is because if you're interested in buying something, or if something is becoming more prevalent in the area where you live or where you're doing the search, the more likely you are to search for it on Google. So in this study, we analyzed Google searches for vertically differentiating versus horizontally differentiating terms that were conducted in conservative and liberal U.S. states. We pooled the data, Google search data, across 50 states from January 2004, when Google search data started to become publicly available, to November 2016. We specifically looked at people's searches for vertically differentiation terms, such as luxury, mansion, jewelry, and convertible. We also looked at Google search data for horizontally differentiating terms, such as creative, unconventional, bohemian, and counterculture. In addition to these general terms, vertical and horizontal differentiation terms, which I've just listed, we also looked at Google searches across 50 states for the two brands that we used in our other studies, Ralph Lauren and Urban Outfitters, to represent vertically versus horizontally differentiating brands. All of this led to the pooling of 130 million searches across these 12 years. What we did next is we matched this data to the information about the conservatism or the liberalism of each state. So we specifically grabbed information about the number of times that each state voted for a Republican presidential candidate in the 5 presidential elections since the data started being recorded. We also looked at the percentage of the population in each state that self-identified as conservatives in a recent Gallup poll. Here is the basic result. The more conservative the state became, the more likely it was to search for vertical terms, vertical differentiation terms, and the less likely it was to search for horizontal differentiation terms, as indicated by this positive coefficient for vertical differentiation and negative coefficient for horizontal differentiation. A very similar pattern of results held when we looked at people's searches, the different states' searches for Ralph Lauren, the vertically differentiating brand, and Urban Outfitters, the horizontally differentiating brand. What this basically shows, it provides some corroboration for the basic idea and premise using larger and a broader set of data. So what does this mean at the end of the day? In a nutshell, what this basically suggests is that political ideology influences the types of brands and products that consumers choose to buy. More specifically, it influences the types of brands and products that people buy to differentiate themselves from others in the marketplace. Conservatives choose products that show that they're better than others to differentiate vertically from others in the hierarchy, whereas liberals choose products that show that they're unique from others in order to differentiate themselves horizontally or laterally in the social hierarchy. These different effects are robust across different types of settings, real and hypothetical choices, measured and manipulated ideology at the individual and state level. This pattern of results, these differences in product and brand preferences, are driven by the differences in conservatives versus liberals' hierarchy beliefs, which means that by changing people's beliefs about the hierarchy using external prompts, situational prompts, it is possible to change people's inherent product and brand preferences. What does this mean from the practical standpoint? Well, it means that You can use information about the political ideology of your customer base in order to design more effective products and marketing strategies. For example, you can use better media strategies to target your consumers more effectively. So recent data shows that conservatives and liberals consume different media. Conservatives are more likely to read the Wall Street Journal and to watch the Hallmark Channel, whereas the liberals are more likely to read the New York Times and watch Comedy Central. Conservatives and liberals also prefer different types of programs. For example, conservatives like Man vs. the Wild on Discovery, whereas liberals like The Soup on E! So if you're marketing a vertically differentiating product, a high price, superiority signaling product such as a luxury brand, then placing it in media that are consumed mostly by conservatives might be more effective, and the opposite would be true for products that are being marketed for their horizontally differentiating benefits. Second is that you can better use your geographic segmentation and targeting strategies in order to reach conservative versus liberal consumer segments better. For example, you could use the latest electoral maps to devise more effective geographic targeting strategies for vertically versus horizontally differentiating products. This also means that you can adjust your positioning and communication strategies in order to appeal to conservative versus liberal consumer segments better. For example, to appeal to conservative consumers, you can use vertically differentiating messages, such as BMW's "My bonus is faster than yours," as shown right here. Or, if you want to appeal to liberal consumers, you can use horizontally differentiating messages, such as BMW's "unconventional" or "driving in the left lane," as shown right here on this slide. Overall, our findings add to emerging growing evidence on the implicit influence that political ideology can have on consumer preferences in the marketplace. For example, one paper showed that conservatives may seek more variety in product assortments than liberals. A different paper showed that conservatives and liberals may be more responsive to different types of recycling appeals. For example, conservatives may be more readily persuaded by recycling messages that appeal to people's civic duty or responsibility, whereas liberals are more persuaded by messages that talk about reducing harm and protecting the environment. A different paper has shown that conservatives and liberals may prefer different movies. For example, conservatives like action-adventure films and sequels featuring female actors, whereas liberals like dramas featuring male African-American leads. There's another paper that showed that conservatives and liberals may prefer different brands in the supermarket, so conservatives like national brands more than liberals. Finally, there's some recent work that shows that conservatives and liberals may have different preferences for luxury. This is very much an emerging field, and there's still much to learn about the implicit influence of political ideology on product preferences. If you would like to illuminate your path in terms of how political ideology influences consumption a little bit better, here's a couple of suggestions for further reading. At this point, I would like to conclude and answer whatever questions that you may have. And please feel free to contact me on the contact information provided here. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Nailya. That was great. A lot of information, very well presented, very persuasive. I like the way you really sort of built conclusions. I want to remind the audience that you can post questions directly through the chat with presenter function on the left-hand corner, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can in the time remaining. I do want to start off by making an observation and get maybe your further thoughts about this. A lot of times when we think about consumer behavior and reasons for making decisions, we tend to think of character attributes that are sort of fixed, maybe because a lot of consumer research comes out of psychology, and that was the model in the early 20th century, that people were extroverted or introverted, and that was pretty much true regardless of the context or circumstances, and that was going to be an overriding factor on how they interacted and how they chose products and so forth. Your research seems to point to a more nuanced idea that a lot of these effects are contextual, or certainly can be nudged one way or the other by the context. Maybe just a little bit more about to what extent are political affiliations, ideology sort of hardwired into people, they maybe are formed earlier and influence pretty much all of your choices henceforth, or to what extent are these actually more malleable and subject to change given experience or the way that a choice is presented to consumers?
Thank you. That's a really important question. In fact, as you have mentioned, conventional wisdom goes that conservative and liberal ideologies are deeply ingrained. They are, to some extent, inherited from families. They're, to some extent, even genetic. So there's some evidence suggesting these really hardwired natures of conservative versus liberal ideologies. What we show is that this picture might be more nuanced. In fact, there are ways to change people's perceptions of their ideology. So social context really matters. If you find yourself talking with more conservative people, you will inevitably feel more liberal in comparison, and vice versa. And this is kind of an emerging view that's coming out of newer research that looks at geographic context and social context in which ideologies might be shifted. So you could make ideologies more versus less salient in order to make people more versus less likely to act upon their ideologies or act consistently with ideologies. So in addition to kind of shifting around potentially people's perceptions of how far they are on the ideological scale, making ideology more versus less salient is another strategy. That said, of course, for very ingrained individuals, for very strong ideologues, I think there's no situational factor that will change their self-perception of their ideology or the extent to which they will be likely to act in accordance with their ideology. So it's very much a matter of degree. So people who tend to be a little bit closer to the middle are more likely to be influenced by these situational factors. But what this emerging research, including our own, shows is that there are ways to change people's perceptions, especially if they're closer to the middle, using these situational cues or kind of using the physical environment and salience cues.
Thanks for that. I think that's really an important point to keep in mind as we, as marketers, think about these distinctions, because when you see the political press coverage, it tends to probably emphasize the differences in how skewed these results are. But to your point just now, probably most of us are somewhere in the middle of that ideology scale that you showed us, and therefore more subject to the kind of contextual influences in our decisions. I wondered if, we actually do have one question I want to get to. Greg raised the well-known example in the last few months of Nike's decision to use Colin Kaepernick's statements and actions as part of their campaign. And I'm curious if you would comment about that. It does seem to kind of speak to the differentiation notion that you had to stand out and be different against maybe the context, which would seem to fit more with the liberal ideology. So maybe your reflections about the specific example of Nike's current campaign.
Yeah, so Nike's campaign is a great example because it illustrates just how important ideology and polarization is becoming in the marketplace and for marketers. And I believe that it belongs in the category of political effects that talk about the explicit influence of polarization in politics on consumer expectations of what companies will do. So a lot of the effects that we talk about here talk about the implicit influence of ideology where people might not be aware of these various effects, whereas with brands speaking out in the context of polarizing political issues, that very much kind of hits the ideological divide, if you will, head on. And I believe that Nike's move was quite interesting, and it was very well deliberated. Perhaps because there's some data showing that when it comes to explicit expectations of consumers in terms of what companies and brands should do in response to political debates and controversies, liberals seem to be more galvanized in terms of their company and brand expectations. So it seems that liberal consumers have stronger expectations from companies in terms of whether or not they should be speaking out compared to conservative consumers. And so Nike, perhaps knowing that potentially its consumer base consists of a larger percentage of younger people who might be leaning more liberal, they calculated that would be, speaking out would be very much in line with the expectations of their growing customer base, which probably tends to skew a little bit more liberal. So that would be my take on that particular example.
No, that's an excellent point, and I think I've seen some of the press coverage that suggested, I don't know that Nike said this, but people were inferring that was a deliberate targeting strategy given the demographics of the typical shoppers for Nike products. Masay asked a question about sort of turning it around and saying the implications of your work for political advertising itself, or the content of advertising. If you sort of work the connections back the other direction, are there in your work any sort of principles that you would suggest about how to communicate the political message based on some of how consumers make choices in the marketplace?
Yeah, so I think that the findings would very directly translate to the political campaigning or political communication context. So conservatives really respond more strongly, more effectively to superiority signaling signals, right? Superiority signaling messages. So political candidates who try to galvanize the conservative base might be better off using messages and cues that talk about their stronger competence, their dominant, perhaps, intellect, or their dominant policy preferences in order to capture the conservative base better. So cues, adjectives, and words that talk about superiority, being better, or being dominant would resonate with conservative consumers better, whereas for liberal consumers, for liberal campaigns, using messages of uniqueness, perhaps being a path breaker, being unconventional, being kind of a change maker, right? Those should resonate with liberal crowds a little bit better because they would communicate the uniqueness or the horizontally differentiated nature of their candidates. So definitely some cues and word choices can be made in the context of political advertising in order to incorporate these findings.
That raises an interesting point. At the very beginning, you made the observation that, at least in the consumer surveys, the self-reported effect of this, people said they were more likely to praise the company that was doing something that they liked rather than criticize it for doing something they don't like. But I wonder specifically in the political context, would, say, a liberal candidate seeking endorsement by authority figures, would that maybe backfire with the liberal audience? Or conversely, would a conservative politician, from using that approach, alienate potentially more liberal candidates, or voters rather? So in other words, the kind of the reactance or the negative reaction from the non-target audience, if you will. So in the case of Nike, are people that were unlikely Nike buyers becoming even less likely to buy Nike as a result, or does it have no impact on them if they're really not focused on the kind of things that Nike is doing?
So I think that's very much in line. The idea that you just proposed is very much in line with what our research would kind of suggest, is that if you are trying to capture liberal voters, consumers, then seeking approval from authority might not be something that would resonate because authority figures are strong cues of hierarchical nature, right, of society and social structures. And so any cues that you try to employ that talk about superiority or authority within that hierarchical structure would not resonate with your liberal consumers, whereas for conservatives that would actually be a plus. And this is in line with some other work that talks about how conservatives versus liberals regard authority. So conservatives respect authority because of this exact idea that they believe that the figures who have authority have reached that authority level because of their hard work and legitimate characteristics, whereas liberals actually disregard or they oppose authority oftentimes because of their opposing beliefs that the hierarchical structure and authority positions within that structure are illegitimate. So definitely very true that appealing to and getting endorsements from authority would be perceived as very different among conservative versus liberal audiences.
That's great, and I think it raises a related question that you also mentioned early on, and that is consumers' expectations for companies relate to how relevant the topic is to what the company does. So when Colin Kaepernick, as a sports figure, has his protest and positions being expressed in a sporting context, there's an obvious connection or relevance there. Any additional thoughts or recommendation for the audience about how to determine the relevance of a particular message to their audience, deciding whether to take a stand one way or the other? I mean, it might either be irrelevant or it might just, as the example as you just gave, backfire if the consumer is not expecting the company to have a stand on that particular topic.
Well, yes. So relevance is truly key. The nature of the issue needs to be relevant to the type of a business, the type of customer base or employees that the company has. So there needs to be a relatively explicit fit, if you will, between the nature of the issue versus the nature of the company's business. So in this graph right here, I showed to you, let me just quickly go back to it, that indeed, there's some variation, right, in terms of how consumers perceive the legitimacy of company voice and action across different types of issues. And I think that the reason why people might expect companies to be more vocal on things like labor laws and human rights is because those are a lot more relevant to the type of activities that a lot of companies engage in, right? They have strong kind of employee base. They provide products and services to different markets, perhaps provide access to different consumers. And so there is a stronger fit with certain issues with a larger percentage of companies, if you will, company activities than others. However, one shouldn't think of this as a formula. A different way in which a company can compensate and speak out on issues that are perhaps a little bit less viewed as less relevant to the core business would be through consistent voice, right? So people look at whether or not the company speaks out consistently. So consistency matters. So if it's a company that speaks out on various issues, then it will be more deemed as more credible in any particular instance. CEOs' character and activities also matter. So an outspoken CEO at the head of the company speaking out on an issue that perhaps might be slightly less relevant to the company's bottom line would be considered as more credible based on how people perceive the sincerity of that CEO figure. So though the number one rule is for the particular issue to be directly relevant to the customer, to the company's core business, such as the CVS example, there are certainly ways to to find paths towards success and relevance through other less well-fitting issues, perhaps.
Well, that's a concluding note, Nailya. I really want to thank you, and again, especially for drawing out the implications of your work towards the end. I thought that was very helpful for the audience to think to what extent this might apply to their own situation and how they can begin to take some steps in accordance with these findings. So thanks again for that. For the audience, we'll remind you that we will be sending out a recording of the webinar soon. If you have additional questions, you can follow up with Nailya at the email address shown on the screen there. I'm sure she would love to hear from you. Do encourage your colleagues who couldn't make it to the live event to watch the archived webinar, which will be on our website probably by the end of today, and again, in the link that we'll be sending to you. And again, I just want to thank the audience and Nailya and remind you all that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. So thanks once again for being part of the audience, and we look forward to seeing you at our next lunch learning webinar.